Hello everybody, and welcome to Mining in Ancient Rome. Today, we're going to take you on a journey through ancient Roman mines. We're going to cover things such as archaeology found, historical writings from Pliny and Diodorus of Sicily, as well as other writers. And we'll also do comparisons of modern mining to ancient Roman mining. There are many important questions asked along the way, such as who mined, what was it mined, where was it mined, why was it important, and I will do my best to answer each one of these questions thoroughly so that you come out with a broad understanding of what ancient Roman mining was. Not all artifacts have been kept in perfect condition, and in such cases we must look towards historical writers such as Pliny and Diodorus for answers. Let's begin this journey starting with archaeology and some writings that explain what ancient Roman mining would be like. So let's start out talking about archaeological evidence found, and in a broader spectrum, let's talk about some excavated sites. We know of large mines such as Rio Tinto and Dalhousie. Rio Tinto is located in Spain, and we know that it was primarily mined for silver. In Dalhousie, we know that they primarily mined gold, and both of these mines were deep vein mines in which they dug underground using several methods, which we will talk about later, to recover such metals. And it was worth their time and effort, which was slow and painful, by the way, to go after these beautiful minerals and elements in the case of gold. So we'll cover that. We'll also cover some of the other minerals that were typically mined. It wasn't always that ancient miners would go underground to find their minerals, and then even in modern mining, it's not always the case that we need to go underground because the ore that we're chasing is on the surface, or sometimes it's embedded in rivers and whatnot. So we'll kind of go over the methods later, but for now, Rio Tinto and Dalhousie are going to be some primary excavated sites that we use in studying ancient Roman mining. So let's first talk about gold. Gold in ancient Rome was obviously used for many things, but typically we understand it used for jewelry, precious goblets, and we actually know as well that gold and silver and other precious metals were often used as bargaining in some cases when politics would be involved instead of war. But humans have always been interested in gold and shiny metals, so I'm going to cover a couple methods on how gold specifically was mined in ancient Rome. But first, let's talk about the geology of gold. So here we have the start. We have a glacier that's on top of a mountain or somewhere on a mountain. And as it starts to melt, the glacier is so powerful it's going to pluck large, huge rocks right out of the mountain. And these rocks actually contain a little bit of gold, usually little nuggets or even smaller, such as just little specks of gold. Well, as the glacier melts, these rocks are going to kind of get pushed down the mountain, and the glacier is melting, causing rivers and such like that. And so this large rock here, I depicted it right here, it starts really big, and it's going to kind of go through a geological process of erosion, and eventually it's going to get smaller, until eventually we get all the way down here, and the rock's completely eroded. It's the sand, it's all you see around in the river is sand, small rocks that are well-rounded, and contained in this sand are little specks of gold that have also kind of fallen out of the big rock as it eroded, leaving what is considered called placer, Placer, material, in which case ancient Romans would go in with baskets, and you may have seen it on TV, but they'll go in with baskets, pretty much the same thing. We do it today. They pick it up, they shake it, and because the gold's so heavy, everything else will kind of separate out of the material, and what was left was gold that they can later take to be refined, melted, and made into blocks. So that's method one And that was probably the first method that was used in ancient Rome, because it was the easiest. You could see the gold right in the sand. People would go up. You could pick it. If it was a big nugget, you could pick it right out. So they got a lot of gold this way. Next, we're going to cover method 2. All right, so method 2, surface deposits. Now, this is the second easiest method to find gold, silver, and many other minerals. But I'm going to briefly talk about the geological process, and then I'll kind of describe the method. So here I have depicted some geological bedding. Over millions of years, these super large beds of material have been deposited. Sometimes it's clay, sometimes it's coal, sometimes it's like a granite or a harder rock. But anyways, these are developed over time. And every now and then, from deep within the core of the earth, lava that carries little bits of gold in it. Let's just depict the lava as this. Will kind of seep its way up into the inside of the mountain here. And in that lava, as it starts getting to the surface, it kind of decompresses, and it wants to just kind of seep into these edges like that, where it's seeping in right on top of a bedding that's kind of weak. So this gold, or this lava that carries gold, is pretty much settling right here. And eventually that freezes, which causes gold and everything else that lava contains, it kind of just freezes right in this bed here. And it causes something like this. This is what it's going to look like, where all of this is rich in gold. And then sometime later, ancient Roman miners, or sometimes just someone out on a hike, would be going along. Here's our person, and they see just a little bit of gold right here, and they say, all right, well, let's go after this. Like, let's get rich and go after this. And so what they do is they'll come in. I'm going to erase this for just a sec. They'll come in and they'll create what's called an adit. I'll make a note here. They create what's called an adit, which is what they're going to take their pickaxes and their shovels and other tools that I'll kind of talk about later. They're going to come in here and pretty much start digging sideways. So they're going to come in and they're going to start taking out that gold just like this into the mountain. Because that's where all the gold is. But they saw the gold right here on the surface, which gave them a good idea that they should just start digging sideways. And what's left is this, which is called, this is all the adit. And they would come in pretty far as they could, but this right here is probably only, they actually said at one point that they had to crawl. They were on their knees and had to lie on their side. And so this right here was only ever about 1 meter to 2 meters tall, which is tiny. You'd have to be on your knees trying to mine this vein of gold. So this is a surface deposit. It's just pretty much called surface vein mining, in which they'd come right after this deposit. So next we'll cover the third method, which is going to go over deep vein deposits. And it's important to note that it wasn't worth the money and the time to go after deep deposits of anything besides gold and silver. We know that the only minerals that were pretty much mined or worth going after were those two, gold and silver. And so therefore, I'll briefly talk about the methods again with silver, but we won't see deep vein mining, which is the third method, ever again. Great. So next, we're going to talk about method number 3. I left the 2 up there. That was my fault. Method number 3 was by far the hardest, and usually it wouldn't take place until after the first 2 methods were tried. So they would first probably find the gold or silver in a bedding, after which, they might start doing driving some adits into mountains because they wanted to find more. And then eventually, if they were finding lots of golden adits by digging sideways into the mine, they would decide to dig what's called a shaft, which I'll make a note of here. So a shaft is a vertical digging. So let's say they have been doing some mining right in here, driving some adits, and they find lots of gold. So what they would do next is they would walk up to the top of the mountain here, and they would start digging vertical shafts like this. They'd be going fairly deep in search of gold, and they would keep digging down until they hit a place where there was a little bit of gold. So let's say, for example, they dug down all the way here and they found more gold, in which case they decided at this point they would create what's called a gallery. Which is an appropriate term because it's exactly what you think of as like an art gallery or any other type of gallery, in which contained is every beautiful, precious thing that you can think of. So this is a gallery. It's this large opening that would be created down here at the bottom. And many of these, we can kind of relate to because it's very similar to what we do today. There are just some minor details that we need to consider, such as, how were the ancient miners supposed to get light down here? And how would they get oxygen down here? I mean, oxygen would come down, and then the oxygen would probably sit right in here, but wouldn't go much farther because there's no pressure or anything to make it want to go any farther. And if there's no oxygen, there's no light. So again, there's lots of limitations that they had back then that we don't have today. So this is the gallery right here, and this is the shaft, and this is an adit. And more or less, the same geological processes in method 2 would happen inside the mountain, but it wouldn't be visible from the edge of the mountain. Like, you couldn't be walking along the hill and see some gold. But because they had seen some gold here in the adit, it caused them to have a desire to kind of search deeper, search farther, in which case they drove these shafts and did this method. So again, method 3 was only used for gold and silver, as they were the only ones that were really profitable and worth the time. Method 2 and method 1 were kind of used for everything. So if you found tin, which was very common to find in Britain, and Julius Caesar knew that, and he would go after the tin because it was useful for bronze making, which bronze was then used for everything you could think of. It seemed like, anything such as weapons, armor, other protection tools, such for blacksmith and whatnot. So it's very useful. So I'll kind of cover some of the tools used next to implement these methods. There have been tools that are found. The only issue is that a lot of tools were somewhat made of wood, for the handles, and because of the organic material, they would kind of decompose over time. So we've had to make some interpretations and kind of bridge the gap with writings. So I'll start covering that. First, So these 3 methods that I've kind of talked about have primarily been assumed from writings from Pliny, in which he describes the method saying, gold in our part of the world is found in 3 ways. First, in river deposits, no gold is more to find, for it is thoroughly polished by the very flow of the stream and by wear. The other methods are to mine and excavate shafts, or to look for it in the debris of undermined mountains. So, you take that passage and you can kind of make a lot of interpretations from it. And with the excavated sites that we have found, such as, Dalhousie, Britannica, we can kind of study them and understand what their limitations were and exactly how they were mined. But, we kind of mix both the knowledge from historical writings and from our excavated sites to make these interpretations. And this is how we get our knowledge, and this is where we're learning from today. All right, so now we're going to talk about tools. So let's move on to that. All right, so tools are an important aspect to mining. And we know quite a bit about tools, mostly from excavated sites. We also know about some tools because of some writings, like Pliny mentions. He talks about a wall being battered to death, and we assume it's from a battering ram, where they would ram a large hammer, more or less, into the rock to kind of crush it. But tools vary depending on what kind of rock it was that they were going after. So if it was hard rock, generally you'd see tools such as a gad. And I'll kind of depict each one of these as we found them. And of course there'll be pictures online on this video. But so a gad, spelled just like that, was pretty much an iron tool that looked just like kind of like a wedge. A wedge that would be hit with a hammer. And of course we have the hammer. Hammers typically were single or double-headed, just like in modern day. But they would be made a little bit different. They'd be using steel iron or stone. It would look something just like that. Probably a little bit more balanced. I'm just a bad artist. So the hammer would pretty much hit this gad into the rock to kind of take a chunk out. So you can picture, here's your wall. You're down inside a mine. Here's your wall. Here's your person with their hammer, and they'd be driving the gad into the wall, which would take out a chunk that would, fall on the ground right here. And that would later be picked up with baskets that were made probably mostly out of a woven material, but it kind of varied. So that was a gad, and that would be used for hard rock. Sometimes the rock would be soft enough that they can go after material with a pickaxe. Pickaxes were fairly commonly found. In fact, there are artifacts that have been found in Baetica, which is I'm drawing a blank, tin mine. Sorry. So just like today, it's pretty generic. It'd be a curved blade that looked something like this. It'd kind of be double-sided. It wasn't too big. It'd usually be between 8 and 10 inches, and it'd be made of iron as well. And that would be pretty much the same way. They would just drive it into the side of the mountain, which would chisel away little chunks of rock at a time. Of course, this wasn't ideal if the rock was too hard, because they'd get very little done. It was better to hit it with the hammer and gad. So methods varied. We also know that crowbars were used pretty much the same as today to kind of take chunks out that were already loose. Tongs would be used sometimes to hold the gad. So sometimes the gad would be held just like this by the miner. They would take the hammer and hit it. Other times, to kind of protect their hands, they would use tongs, which would hold it. It would keep their hands safe from the hammer, and then they would go at it with the hammer, like that. So we know that existed, and of course there were other tools such as like a headlamp kind of gear. It wasn't a headlamp. They'd usually carry these. They were made out of just bronze, and they would put some fuel in it for lanterns, for lights. But these were the primary tools. It wasn't too advanced as it is today. Today, obviously, we have machines that do all the work. But they're electric hammers, things like that, make it much easier, make it much faster. This was tedious work that was not fast-paced. They weren't moving nearly at the speed that we do today, or any time recently since machines have been invented. But what we do know from a mining historian named Agricola, who was a historian much later into the 1700s, where he started writing in detail about mining methods, that these same tools were used all the way up into the 1700s, even 1800s. But very little advances were made, but this was ideal for what needed to be done. I do want to mention one thing, actually. The gad and the hammer, after this little indent would be made, created an opportunity to take a pickaxe, actually, or even sometimes other tools. They would actually drive those other tools into that little that space right there because that's actually a structurally weak spot in the rock that allowed them to kind of make cracks. They were actually able to take off much larger chunks at a time after they created the initial indent, more or less. So that's actually really important to know because that was the method used underground. So to understand, the process of ancient mining, you need to understand that that's a main thing that they would do. They'd create this little indent in which they could take a big chunk off. You can kind of picture it if you think about, I don't know if you've gone up to like a clay outcrop in when you go out on a hike, but you can go up, grab a piece, and kind of pull it off because it's structurally weak in the back where the molecules have sort of aligned. That's probably more in depth than you need, but that's an important method and using tools for underground mining, surface mining. Not so much placer mining. Again, placer mining they used these baskets to kind of sift through the material. They kind of shake it again, lose some material. These tools weren't needed. All right, so let's talk about some limitations of mining as we kind of sum up what we've been talking about so far. So let's say ancient miners drive these shafts. They drive them really deep. So what are they going to face? What are some of the problems they face, and how do we know they existed? Most of the limitations that we know of, we've read about from those authors such as Diodorus or Plethy. There's some others, but here are the three main limitations or problems that miners would run into. And first, we're going to talk about ventilation. Ventilation or lighting is going to be kind of the derivative of ventilation, and water is its own category because it's really unique and how the ancient Roman miners went after water issues is pretty awesome. They came up with some inventions. So we'll kind of cover that. Let's start with ventilation. So with ventilation, we know. So let's kind of pick this with some pictures, kind of help understand. So again, we drive these shafts deep underground like that, right? And we know that oxygen will kind of come down. Some things to consider though is that down in the galleries, when you're mining, there's gas that builds up over time. There's like sulfurous gas. There's chlorine gases that you have to consider. And these are just natural gases that kind of just are embedded in the rock. It's hard to explain, but when you mine it, those gases are released. So they don't want to test. They don't want to send people down there. They would die instantly. There's one, either no oxygen, or two, they're poisoned and die. So first, they drive the first shaft, and they say, all right, we got to test this. And we know this from Diodorus. He explains that they would use these, he called it a well. We know it's a shaft. But more or less, they would drop down with probably just a rope after they've dug quite a bit. Let's say that this doesn't even exist yet. This is like their preliminary studies. They have to make sure that this is feasible. So on this rope is attached a lantern. Okay? So let's just say this is my lantern, right? Let's make a little flame. So if they could drop this, if they're able to drop this all the way down, and the light doesn't go out, it means that there is oxygen. We know that flames need oxygen because it's using the oxygen to fuel itself and burn hot. But if there's a bunch of gases, that little flame's going to go out. And if that's the case, then there needs to be another shaft driven down parallel to this one to help the oxygen move. And we actually know from some of the writings that this was the case. So what they would do to depict this again, so of course they lift this back up, blah, 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 blah. And what they had to do was they had to create another shaft parallel to this one right here. And what would happen is that when they got down here, they kind of creates this kind of U shape. It's called convection ventilation, more or less. What happens is that as air comes down, gases and heat naturally want to rise. And what's happening is that as the gases rise right here, it's forcing this material to kind of come down as well. So more or less, we're forcing good air down and gases and heat up. And it's this constant cycle, and it was fairly effective. Obviously, it's time consuming because they had to take the time to drill another shaft. And the whole time they're drilling a shaft, they're not making money. So that's a big concept to understand as far as limitations go and what they had to do in order to overcome those limitations. This is an ingenious idea. A fair amount of thought. The other thing to consider, something to note here, and these methods are actually still used today in mining. These aren't necessarily abandoned ideas. Now, there's other ways that we go about it. Sometimes we'll push air in with fans and other methods today. But in the old times, they didn't have fans, obviously, and so they had to use natural occurrences to kind of cycle these processes. The other thing to consider is that for every 10 meters you go down, approximately, the temperature is going to go up 1 degree Celsius. Guys, it's not cold underground. In fact, it's hot. It can get really hot depending on where you are. Typically, mines, as you go down, are getting closer to the core, and in the core, there's energy. There's actually heat, and that heat's not being released up into the atmosphere like it is on the surface. So this is actually something that they had to learn and overcome. So let's say they have to go down. So every 10 meters, 1 degree Celsius, right? So if you come down 100 meters, well, you went up 10 degrees Celsius. It's hot. And so this same method was used to kind of help transfer that heat back up. Bring this cool air up here down. Bring the hot air here, go up. Very smart. Next, we're going to talk about, lighting. Because of that method, it makes it simple for us to talk about lighting, because like I mentioned earlier, you'd have to consider oxygen to lighting. They use lighting to test oxygen. So these are kind of related. But more or less, you have your shaft, you have your gallery, and they're working down there. And what they would do is they would just kind of dig these little indents into the wall. And they would set up candles here. They'd set some candles up over here to kind of help the workers see what they're doing. It was just required. What we do know also from some texts is that the miners would wear a candle that would literally be attached to their hat. And they had leather hats. We know that. We found some leather artifacts of ancient realms and mines. So we know that they wore some other hats as well as an apron that was typically made out of leather to kind of help protect them, keep them relatively clean, mostly for protection. And also had some pockets to keep extra tools in. So they carried these lanterns on their head. I keep getting off on tangents, but so that was one method. And then this is all being fed by oxygen. That way, the lights wouldn't go out. The heat was being transferred. Gases were being released. This wasn't necessarily safe. Sometimes gases are still being released that you don't know about. And in the case of, let's say, coal, in modern coal, when you're mining coal, there's a gas released, and it's flammable. So you can imagine taking a candle as you're mining coal. Next thing you know, you have an explosion, which has happened many times. We've had to learn through history. We have had to make some changes. But this was dangerous to use candles, but that's all they had. And the candles were typically made out of they'd use wick, typically some kind of wax, oil-based, that was flammable, and it would kind of slowly burn. Diodorus says in one of his texts that they would use lighting as a source as a tool to know the shift period. So when you're underground, you don't have the moon at night and the sun at day. It's just dark all the time, and you have some lighting. But how are you supposed to know what time of day it is? You don't know how long you've been working. So they designed these candles to kind of burn 8 to 10 hours, depending on the shift or something like that, so that when the candles started going out, they know, all right, my shift's up. It's time to go home. Really ingenious. Next, let's talk about water control. Now, this is cool. This is where they had to make some inventions. And we know that a lot of mines stopped. I'm going to move this up just a little bit so you can see me better. We know that a lot of mines, looking at excavated sites, only went down to the water table. Deep underground, there's a typically spot where water builds up. That's like where all the water is, and you can't go past it. You start digging down, it's going to become a lake. It just fills up with water. There's tons of water in these mountains from just snow, from rain, from anything, the cycle of water. Well, when you're mining these shafts, let's put water on here so we know what we're talking about. When you're mining these shafts, you start going down. Next thing you know, you're going to hit some water down here. Well, what do? Well, like I said, a lot of times they gave up at that point. They said, all right, we can't go any farther. Then someone came up with what's called the Egyptian screw. They used it a little bit earlier than Romans, but right in that same time. The Egyptian screw was a cylinder. I'm just going to have to try to describe it. So it's this large cylinder, and it had a screw in the center that came up. And so what they were able to do is a slave or a worker would be able to turn the top of the screw, and the screw as it turns worked kind of like an auger. If you guys have ever been ice fishing, it's very similar. As you drill, it kind of pulls up this water. And they used waterproof material to keep the water from soaking into the wood, or if it was bronze. But anyways, they'd screw it up to the top, and it would kind of drain off into another adit. This is complex because you couldn't just screw it all the way back up to the top. What you had to do, so let's say here's your water table, they would have to drive a little adit right here. And that adit would then be used, and they'd also have to make it a slope. So here's another thing to consider, because water wants to move downhill. So they would take this screw, which would take the water up right here, and then dump it in here. That would fill up. They'd have to make another one here and do the same thing. And they'd have to keep doing that and keeping the water out of the working so that the miners could get in there, chisel away, and get some work done. So that was the first method of two methods that we know of. We have found and we have read about these augers, and it's actually in quite good detail. There's going to be all the sources will be listed on this video in the description below. So check them out. It kind of has some more detail, kind of lets you read about it, learn a little bit more. Anyways, the second method is the wheel. Now, it's not the wheel that we think of. It's not used for wheelbarrows or cars or anything like that. This wheel was kind of what you think of as like a large water wheel. And as it moves, it's scooping up water at the bottom, dumping it at the top. It was also an ingenious idea. Typically, we know they're between 10 and 13 meters, which also kind of helped us gauge the size of these mines. They vary, but these wheels would have these little buckets that would pick up the water right here at the bottom. It'd pick it up, and it'd bring it up to the top and dump it here. And it would probably dump it into an adit that they had to drive specifically for water, so they could dump water back into the earth. So, and that would be the process, and they would set that up where there was water. Now, this wasn't 100% effective, and neither was the screw, but this moved more water fast. This wheel usually had about 20 little buckets that scoop up about a meter long, like a box, a rectangle box, about a meter. And we know that this method was probably about 40%. We've done studies today from what we know, 40 to 50% effective, which was more effective than the screw, but the screw moved more water per minute. The screw was actually more effective per minute with quantity, but not as much with quality. It's kind of hard to explain. So there's some trade-offs. This one would be good to move more water. The other one would be, to move water faster, and the screw would be used to move more water. So it kind of depends on the situation. And each situation was analyzed, and there's probably a mine manager or someone that was in charge would say, all right, this is what we have to do. So those were the limitations, and it's very interesting to read about, how they had to overcome those limitations. Again, there's a link from UNC on here that really goes into detail on each one of these limitations. Definitely worth reading. Alright guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video lecture on ancient Roman mining. Please again look below in the description for my sources and look through those. Give yourself an opportunity to learn a little bit more. Ancient Roman mining was such a unique aspect of the Roman culture because they needed these materials for everything. Obviously you needed wood, and that wasn't mined, but it was gathered. There's a saying that if it's not mined, or if it's not grown, it's mined, and that's true today as it is in ancient Rome. So we covered the tools used, we covered gold and the methods used for gold. I do want to mention that silver and gold are pretty much mined the same, and there's a list of other minerals that were mined as well, some of which let's find exactly. So it says copper, silver, tin, there were emeralds, of course gold again. Marble was used all the time for buildings and kind of superficial facets on buildings. Lead and salt were all very commonly mined materials. Again, everything but gold and silver were only ever really mined using just surface methods like placer mining or surface vein chasing, but they wouldn't go very deep because it's just, you're spending a lot of time, a lot of money. It's also important to know that the workers of a mine typically were all slaves. Slaves drove the mine production, and that's critical to know because it wasn't civilians. Civilians weren't out there. It was a dangerous job. People died. Hard, laborious work. We know it's hot. We know from some graphics that were drawn that, these people would have to work naked because it was so hot. And these are things that civilians wouldn't want to do, and so they'd bring in slaves to get this done. But all these minerals, all these commodities had to be mined, it had to be done, and later to get sent to processing, which is its a whole own category. Processing these materials was not easy. It required high temperature, it required a skilled metallurgist, and so these are all things to consider. Again, read the descriptions, read some of my sources, great articles, and I hope you enjoyed this. Have a great day.